These days, I hear so many traumatic birth stories, especially when it comes to hospital-based births. And as important as it is to know what not to do at the hospital, it's just as important to surround yourself around positive examples of beautiful hospital birth stories. So in this video, I share the story of my firstborn, Olivia. When I look back at this birth, I feel so proud, so empowered, and really, really happy with my hospital-based birth. If you're new here, my name is Kelly, your online doula, educator, and #1 fangirl for all things birth. In this channel, I teach you how to avoid unnecessary medical interventions and how to feel ready and empowered for your birth. When I was pregnant with my first baby, my goal was to have an unmedicated hospital birth. But this wasn't the case throughout my entire pregnancy. It wasn't until halfway through my pregnancy that I watched the documentary, The Business of Being Born. And it was watching that that made me realize that I had options and agency over my birth experience. And in watching that documentary, I learned specific questions I could ask my OB to see if I was matched up with the right provider. It turns out I wasn't. And so at 25 weeks, I switched providers and found some midwives that were hospital-based midwives and able to support me in my vision for birth. I really would have loved to birth at a birthing center. However, money was in the way because I couldn't quite afford to pay the fee for a birthing center. And at the time, I had really good health insurance that covered my hospital birth 100%. I think I only paid one copay at the time, like $25 to have my firstborn baby, which is crazy. I don't even think that happens anymore. But because of that, I chose the hospital. But I also knew that it would be really important to have an advocate in the room, even though I had hired midwives, hospital-based midwives, to be my provider. So I decided to hire a doula, and a doula could support me and my husband and help advocate for my birth wishes in the hospital. Actually, one of the main things that I attribute to my positive birth experience was the birth team and setting that I chose to birth in and with. I believe because I was intentional about who was in the room and what room I was in the first place, that I was set up to have a positive birth experience. On June 15th, I went into early labor. It was Father's Day at the time, and I spent all day feeling excited and trying to rest as best as I could, but really I've never been that good of a napper and couldn't really fall asleep. But I did know that it was important to lay down in between contractions, eat really healthy, hydrate, and just try to take it easy and be calm. As the day and evening and early night went on, my contractions started getting closer together. It was around midnight that I called my doula and asked her to come to my house and labor at home with me for a little while so that she could help us decide when we should go to the hospital. After laboring at home with me for about an hour or two, my contractions were about 5 minutes apart. And so we decided it was time to go to the hospital. It was only a 15-minute drive, so it was very quick to get there. And I felt like I had been laboring all day and far into the night, and my contractions were 5 minutes apart, so surely I should be well along in labor. Well, pretty typical of first-time moms, I was not. When I was checked at triage, I was only at a 2. This felt really discouraging to me, and they actually said I could stay at the hospital because they weren't that busy that night. And so I was really happy about that at the time and decided to stay. What I wish I would have done, looking back, is I wish I would have gone home and stayed at home a bit longer until my contractions were more like 3 to 4 minutes apart. Of course, hindsight is 2020, and it is what it is. At the hospital, I was allowed a lot of freedom to move, walk, get in the tub, get in the shower, and have intermittent fetal monitoring so that I could just kind of do my thing. So this went on for hours and hours. It wasn't until about 32 hours into my labor that I was dilated to a 5. I remember my doula and my husband, and actually my mom and sister were even in the room. Everybody was trying to get me to eat. And logically, I knew that I was supposed to be eating, but I just wasn't hungry. I couldn't imagine eating. And so, after about 32 hours of being in labor without sleeping or eating much, I consented to an IV, which would fill me with electrolytes and a little bit of glucose to keep my stamina up. Actually, several hours later, I allowed my mom to spoon feed me some protein rich snacks. So I had a spoonful of cottage cheese, a little bit of protein, and a honey stick. A notable point of my labor process is that my contractions actually never got really close together. And because of this, my labor was really, really slow. And when I did things like get into the tub or the shower, my contractions slowed down even more, which is actually really normal for getting into the water. I remember at some point starting to wonder about the epidural. By then, I had been in labor for about 42 hours and I wasn't progressing. But I set many goals for myself and said things like, I'm just going to labor for another hour right here. And if at my next cervical exam, I'm not further along dilated, I might entertain the idea of an epidural. I also remember feeling a little guilty around that point that I was going against my birth plan by getting an epidural, and kind of wondered if my doula would judge me, because when I had hired her, I said, I'm hiring you to help me have an unmedicated birth. And so I was a little worried about her. And what's interesting about that is that emotion of being worried about other people in the room is actually really common for laboring people, to be thinking more about everyone else in the room than themselves. Not sure if this is like nature's way of kicking in some nurturing, or maybe it's just my personality. But either way, I remember feeling that way. Like, I want the epidural, but I'm afraid that my doula will judge me. Turns out my doula had been, for the last 5 to 10 hours, thinking that an epidural might be the exact thing that I needed to be able to progress in labor. Because by that time, I'm going over 40 hours in labor without really any sleep or substantial food, and not dilating very far. And so my doula began to wonder if an epidural was just the thing I needed to be able to rest and to let my body relax so that I could finish dilating. I decided to get a cervical exam before making my decision about the epidural. And when I learned I was still stuck at a 5 all this time, there was no doubt in my mind that it was time for the epidural and time for me to get some much needed rest. During the epidural, my nurse woke me up and asked if I would want some Pitocin, because remember, my contractions were really far apart. And so I declined the Pitocin because I really, really didn't want to do that. I didn't want to interrupt the natural release of oxytocin in my body. And I also knew that Pitocin can sometimes lead to fetal distress and cause even more painful contractions. And so I declined the Pitocin, but then allowed myself to just rest with that epidural. And it was actually rest that I needed more than Pitocin, because after 5 hours, I was fully dilated to a 10. My baby also dropped to a +2 station during that time. By the time I was ready to push, the epidural had worn off quite a bit. So I was actually able to get up onto all fours with the help of my birth team and push in lots of different positions, from all fours to leaning up over the headboard of the hospital bed, putting down the foot rests so that I could be in the queen's throne position. And eventually the squat bar came up, and my doula tied her birth scarf so that I could grab the scarf and pull myself up during a contraction, and that helped me a lot as well. My contractions were still quite far apart, and so I had been pushing for about 2 hours, and really there still was not much sign of my baby. Our heart rate was great. My blood pressure was great. So there wasn't really a lot of reason to push an intervention besides my own comfort and just being tired. And I later learned that my midwife used a little tactic on me where she said that if I didn't deliver the baby by the next hour, which gave me about 40 minutes, that she would have to call the OB to go get the vacuum and use a vacuum assisted birth. And I looked at her dead in the eye and I said, "Oh no, you're not." And within a few more pushes, I got my baby out. Olivia came out sunny side up, posterior, which makes a lot of sense given how long my labor was. She was a malpositioned baby and for whatever reason didn't have the space inside to rotate to optimal fetal position, which is one of the reasons why my labor was so long. Olivia was born 8 pounds on the dot, 23 3/4 inches, with an APGAR score of 7. I did have a first-degree tear from the pushing stage and was stitched up, given 2 stitches. And I later found out that I was given some Pitocin for delivering my placenta. Nobody asked me if I would want Pitocin or not, and if they did, I would have said no. This is something I'll never forget and something I definitely teach my clients about in prenatal visits. There are some key things that I attribute my positive hospital birth experience to. Number one is my birth team and birth setting. Everybody and every place that I was in believed and trusted in my body's ability to birth. They believed that birth was low risk unless proven otherwise. And having that space and trust to allow my body to do what my body was going to do was everything that I needed to be able to just be patient and slow and wait and see. It also helped that my blood pressure was never a concern, fetal heart rate was never a concern, and so really there was no medical need to intervene at all at any given time, and that allowed kind of everybody to just be off my back. It wasn't until I requested the epidural that intervention was given, besides the Pitocin, of course, during the 3rd stage. I also truly believe my positive birth experience was because of how much time and energy I put into getting educated about my options and about what I could expect from a hospital birth. And being able to advocate and speak to my wishes and vision really set me up for a good experience. Also, going into spontaneous labor helped me have a positive birth experience. My baby was ready to be born on the day she chose to be born. I didn't need extra intervention or medicine to get things going, which I believe helped me have a positive experience. And lastly, even though my wish was to have an unmedicated birth, I have zero guilt or negative feelings about consenting to an epidural for this birth. Even though I made this birth plan, it was really important to also remain flexible about the birth plan because we can't control birth. As much as I'd love to think I could control my birth, of course I couldn't. And when someone is in labor for the total was 56 hours of labor, I feel like the epidural was awesome, and I am so glad I got it when I did. And I always say to my clients that a well-timed epidural can be a beautiful thing. I know that firsthand. And I had a team around me who supported my birth wishes, but never held them against me. And so there you have it, my positive birth experience. And no, it didn't go exactly to plan, but I feel so good about it. If you like this video, check out my series, Better Hospital Birth. It's linked in the description below and right here. Thanks everyone for listening, and I hope this inspires you for your hospital birth.